it's 2 hours each. And I was like, what? I was like, are you serious? And I'm like, man, there's no way. Welcome back to the podcast, A Convo with. Today, I'm very, very excited. The conversation that we're having today is with Ellie Yang Camp. She is an artist and educator from the San Francisco Bay Area, a high school history teacher, a full-time parent, a calligrapher, an anti-racist educator, and now an author. She has a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in education from Stanford. We'll definitely get into kind of how we met and the course that I was able to take. But before I get into all that, Ellie, thanks for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me, Jeremy. It's early here. We're across the ocean, so it's 7:30 a.m. in California and it's 10:30 p.m. in Taiwan. So it's thank you for coming and thank you for having me on. It's kind of fun to do this across space and time.
Yeah,
this conversation.
I'm definitely shout out to the technology because I actually didn't know how possible this was, but yeah, we're very excited. Ellie's up early, I'm up late, but yeah, just to kind of kick things off, if you could give the listeners maybe a little bit of background, how do we meet, and kind of what was that experience, and what were you able to kind of teach me and my team on?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the way we know each other is about 6 years ago. It was It was between 2018 and 2019. Is your team hired me on, basically to teach your team a course about race and Asian American identity, it was pretty much a surprise that I got this request because at the time I had been a public high school history teacher, but I was staying at home with my kids at that point and I was not working. And the reason, I guess how you guys found me was I was going to church with someone who worked for you, Alan. And that church that we were going to at the time, I was trying to do these workshops basically as a volunteer in the church to, it was like 2017, 2018. So there was a lot of racial stuff going on in the United States at the time. Black Lives Matter was starting to become more of a rallying cry. And there was a lot of need for discussion between people and learning about what racism was. And so I was doing these workshops in that church, or trying to do these workshops in that church. But I actually remember it very vividly is one day at the end of church, everyone's getting up to leave the sanctuary, and Alan calls out to me and he's like, Ellie, he's like, I have something to ask you. And I'm like, what is it, Alan? And he's like, obviously I knew that he worked for you. And he was like, our team is looking for someone to teach us about racism and Asian American stuff. And I was wondering if you would be interested. And I was so confused because I'm like, why me? Because I'm like, Jeremy, at the time you were already very famous. I'm like, this is Jeremy Lin. He's a very well-connected person. He's very well-resourced. And I would have assumed that there would have been somebody that did this for their job full time, maybe as a consultant or something like that. And Alan was trying to tell me more about it. And I was like, let me think about it. I'm not sure. I was staying at home with my kids. I was like, I'm not really looking for a job. I mean, my life was very full. And so I remember walking away, and then I 5 or 10 steps, and I literally stopped and I turned around and I walked back up to him. I'm like, why me? And I remember he's like, well, you know what? We know that we're looking for someone because we're trying to figure out something, but we don't know what that something is. And I think you might be the person to help us figure out what that is. And I was like, this is very intriguing to me and very curious to me. So after he said that, I was like, okay, I'll do it. But so after that, I think it took a span of about 9 months. I mean, it was a very busy year. Your team was like we weren't all in the same place. There were people like across the United States, someone was in Asia. And so I remember we would do these classes, these online classes. I don't even remember. It was like every couple weeks, every month. Sometimes we would take a long break in between. This was that season that you were playing. You started out on the Hawks and then you got traded to Toronto, like a very big year. You won the championship, all that kind of stuff. So there, just to say, there was a lot going on that year. And I think you were, from what I could tell, under a lot of stress. For me, teaching the class was actually quite stressful because it was this very whirlwind, high pressure. It felt very high pressure to me. But I mean, we did it. We walked through it. It was all online. So that was also a very new experience for me. I had never taught anything online. This was before the pandemic, so most people were not very familiar with doing everything online. So it was quite a whirlwind. But in that class, yeah, like I think at the beginning it took a little bit of time to figure out exactly what you guys were looking for, because what was very different about the setup of this class was you guys were all Asian American. I would say you were all East Asian American Christians that knew each other already. A lot of you guys were in the same family, right? Or they were very good friends, or, you know, a very trusted circle. And usually in my experience doing this type of work, it's like you're getting together people that have different racial backgrounds that maybe don't know each other super well, or maybe they, you know, they know each other just kind of like in the neighborhood or in the church, but they haven't heard each other's stories, right? And so usually that type of work, which is more akin to like DEI work, is like, how do you get those diverse people to come together and hear each other's stories and talk to each other? But with your group, it was a bit of a challenge to figure out what you guys needed because you guys already knew each other. And racially, you guys are all the same. Racially, we're all Asian American. So I thought it was really interesting. After a little bit, I remember me and Patricia had a conversation to kind of huddle together to be like, okay, how are we feeling with where things are going? You know, what's working, what's not working. And I think what we stumbled upon is what you guys really just wanted was a bunch of history lessons about American history, specifically not just Asian American history, but kind of like racial history. So what we did was we went through Black history first, and then we went through Asian American history to kind of tie those things together. So I think that was the bulk of the class, but it feels like it was a while ago. I mean, does it feel like it was a while ago to you?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely feels like a while ago. And, you know, I remember, yeah, such a hard assignment for you because this whole time, you know, growing up, race to me was not that complex, right? Like I knew I was Asian in a non-Asian industry. I knew there was a ton of debate about who I am and what kind of Asian am I and who is going to claim me and this and that and who is not going to claim me as being theirs or whatever. And there was just a whole bunch of that. And then when it came to racism, it was really simple. It was just people would make the classic Asian jokes or slurs or you know, even worse type stuff. And that was racism to me. So, you know, I had this team that runs my brand. I'm younger than everybody else. I'm also not as wise as everybody else. And Patricia Sun, the CEO of the company, along with a couple of other people, but primarily Patricia, had been saying, you really, like, it would go a long way if you and our team, our primary Jalen brand team, and also the foundation team board, if we all learned a little bit more about race, about our identity and things like that. And so she had been pushing for a while, but obviously it's always so busy. So we did like, I mean, do you remember how many classes we did? Like eight to 10?
Somewhere around that. I would say
And
8 to 12. I don't remember exactly.
8 to 12. And each one, do you remember how long each one was?
I remember, I think they were, I think they were probably about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, but we were trying to
Yeah.
keep it closer to an hour and a half because I think it was like 6 o'clock California time and you are on the East Coast. So you were dialing in at 9 p.m., taking a history
Yeah.
class. And I was like, I felt so bad for you. I was like, oh my gosh, this guy is coming in after like a long, hard day. And he's like trying so hard to like pay attention and be present. But like, I just remember some of those classes, I could kind of see your eyes going like, and I was like, oh man. But like, I totally respected that. I was like, look at this man. Like he's trying. He's trying so hard. So I thought that was very commendable, honestly.
No, I appreciate it. And I know because I am typically like, one, I don't love meetings. Two, I don't love class. I know everyone's like, oh, you went to Harvard. But I hate class. I've always hated
Yeah.
class. I love studying on my own, and I just love studying on my own and learning everything on my own. That's kind of just how I've always done it. And so I remember very vividly, it was definitely 2 hours because I remember Patricia was like, all right, it's like whatever, 8 to 12 sessions. Let's just say it's 10 sessions. And she was like, it's 2 hours each. And I was like, what? I was like, are you serious? And I'm like, man, there's no way. And then she was like, hey, I really think it'd be good. And so I was like, all right, like I'll lock in, I'll dial in if, if everybody is on board. And so everybody got on board and we started it. And I just remember, it like went above and beyond my expectations. And obviously it was 9 to 11 p.m. So I don't know if you remember this, but there was just so much good information that I felt like after 3 or 4 sessions, I was like, I can't retain all of this. And I need to, like, we're putting in a huge time investment across
Yeah.
like 4 different time zones globally. Like, I need to make sure that this is really, really worth our time. And so I started taking these notes, and I took like so many notes. And every session, I would like refine this document on my computer, and then at the end, I sent it like out to, it was like, whatever, a couple pages or 2, 3 pages of all of what I felt like was the most important information, and I like sent it out to everybody. But I was like, okay, I have it all written down, so at any point I need to go back, I need to like refresh my
Mm-hmm.
memory, or I can look at it holistically, I can do that. But like, for me to be able to even take those notes and do it that way, like, just shows how impactful it was. Because and like, that's just something that's pretty out of character for me.
As a teacher, it warms my heart a bit. I was like, oh yay! Like as a student, like you're engaging with information. Um, do you remember growing up? Had you gotten any sort of education about, I would say, Black history, Asian American history? I mean, probably not about racism. I mean, most schools don't even barely go that far. But had you learned anything at all?
So I came in knowing nothing. I just knew the
Okay.
standard California education. I didn't know anything about African American history, anything about Asian history. And that's why it was so mind blowing.
Mm,
Um, and I know, like, I mean, there's a lot more that I have to say that we'll get into later, about like how this class was the kind of like, it opened my eyes, or it was like, it was an open door. And from there, so many
hmm
things happened, which actually I've never even told you. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. But before,
it's really
just,
fun to have this conversation. As teachers don't usually get a lot of feedback, especially high school teachers.
yeah,
Like, unless you happen to be like that really popular teacher that everybody visits after they graduate. I was not one of those people. I also didn't teach seniors, but like, I don't usually get students that come back and be like, "Oh, this really impacted my life." So
mm,
it's really nice to hear.
okay, yeah, no, I'll definitely get into that. I want to ask you a couple questions
Mhm,
first before
mhm.
I kind of jump into sharing the evolution of
Okay,
that
yeah.
class. But yeah, I mean, I had one question. So when you taught us, like, why did you, which is a very interesting question, like, why did you decide to teach us African American history alongside
Mhm.
Asian American history? And well, there's also a lens of faith in there.
Yeah.
So you can answer it all in one question or kind of break it up. But I wanted to also understand, like, how does faith influence your anti-racist work and education?
Okay.
So yeah, maybe we'll start with the first one. Like, why did you decide to teach? Obviously, we're a group of, I mean, how many? I don't know. There's like 8 of us, 10 of us. We're
Yeah.
all East Asian, Asian Americans. Why did you feel it was important to first start with African American history?
Well, you guys were asking me not just to talk about Asian American history. Your questions were specifically about race. And it's something I really respected about how you guys were, like how responsible you guys were being about your platform and wanting to engage in those types of conversations. And in my experience, like this is also coming from how I learned about things like that, is that when you teach, like it's possible to learn Asian American history and not fully understand how race works in the United States. And my belief is that if you want to engage and really understand racism, you have to understand, at least at a basic level, some Black history, because the way the system of white supremacy works in the United States hinders on this binary between white and Black, and, you know, in roots of the enslavement of Black people and things like that. And those are like the foundations of how the system of white supremacy has been built in the United States. And so even to understand what it means to be Asian American, I think a lot of Asian Americans, we enter these questions because we want to learn about ourselves, right? And so it's like, yes, tell me stories about people that look like me, that I can relate to. And I think that's so important. But I think that sometimes that's all we do. And then we're not really learning about what that means racially and what our role in the whole system of the United States is. And so for this class, I was like, we're talking about race. We're not just talking about being Asian American, which is, you know, so many things too. But if we're talking specifically about race, I'm like, I don't think you can understand American racism without understanding at least some Black history. So that's what I was kind of trying to do. I was trying to basically create this frame of like, you know, this is what race in America means and this is what it's like. And then Asian Americans fit into that. But if we don't understand the frame, it's really hard for us to understand what it means to be us. So a lot of the work that I do now which is very specifically trying to teach about race with an Asian American centered focus, is trying to get people to understand the system more. So not just what does it mean to be Asian American? I mean, that and is very closely tied to understanding more than just us. And I don't think we can truly understand what it means to be us if we don't understand the context that we live in. Okay. So that was the first question. What was the second question? About faith. You know, it's interesting because I was a public high school teacher. So in my professional job, I actually don't include a lot about faith at all. Like my professional life, and even like with this book, the book that I wrote is not a Christian book specifically. And being a public high school teacher, it's inappropriate for me to be bringing my own personal faith into the classroom all the time. But my personal story of, caring about racism, caring about anything that is justice oriented is very deeply rooted to my faith, right? And so for you guys, like I know how important your faith is to you. You've talked about it a lot, or you used to, or you have. And I knew that the team, like, I was looking at, like, what are all the common things? It's like, they're all East Asian, they're all Christians, and we're all kind of a general certain age group, right? And so it's like, what are all the common themes that we can bring together on that? But also, when we talk about topics of injustice, and in this case, specifically racism, I think as whole people, like, it naturally engages those spiritual parts of ourselves, right? It's like, racism isn't just about like what happened in the past, but it very much ties into what we think is right and wrong, our morals. Like, why do we think we're here? How much value do we think other people have, right? You know, or like even if I'm benefiting from like a racist system in certain ways, like what about the system is striking me as so unjust that I just don't want to have a part of it, right? Those are very spiritual questions. Like those dig into our ethics. And so I just thought it was a very natural thing to do. And I had also had some experience, you know, talking about some of these topics when I was teaching high school. And I started to become very sensitive to the idea that, you know, I wanted my students to know information. But then one time I had a student come back to me, and he was like an Asian American. He's probably like 15-year-old boy. And he came back to me, nobody else was around. And he was like, you know what we talked about in class today? It made me really sad. It made me really, really sad. And I could kind of see on his face, and I started to get kind of concerned about, his mental health, right? Where I was like, oh no, I want to speak the truth about these things, speaking truth to power, education is going to empower us. But at the same time, what does this do to us as people, right? It's hard to keep hearing sad stories about people that look like you, or maybe things that people that look like you, bad things that you've done, And so, so I wanted for our class to incorporate some of that spiritual element into it. I think especially if we were engaging with things that were very hard, like if we're talking about lynchings, like really, really horrible things, like, as an educator, I found it kind of irresponsible to talk about all these terrible things and then just to leave us all hopeless, right? And so like incorporating, I think I inserted some prayers. It's like after we go through this, like let's pray about it, right? Or let's ask God, like what do we do about this, right? Because like I don't have very specific answers about, here's the checklist of this is what we need to do, this, and this. It's like it's kind of different for everybody. And it changes depending on what's going on. But if we can engage that part of ourselves and just to kind of infuse some more hope, like how do we, like get out of like the rut and bring more hopeful, like engage with that spiritual part of us that can bring more hope and be more visionary and all that kind of stuff. Like to me, all that is very spiritual work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that was like, so adding in those two elements, one is not just Asian American history, just the context of history and race, and then adding in faith. I think those two things were so trajectory changing for me and also for our brand, the Jalen brand, because like we're in a place where we wanted to learn. And I felt like the thing that was so powerful about this course was that I spend the majority of my life in this brand, in a public spotlight, and you're always trying to convey and storytell to the world what is going on, and you need this content, and you need this never-ending cycle of content. But this was actually like a nice, like under the radar, nobody knew about it.
Yeah.
Pause, where it's just like we're gonna dive into race and faith and race holistically. And I felt like that was just like so necessary for us to really build a foundation of conviction. Who are we? What do we want to stand for? Like what kind of impact do we want to make? And faith definitely ties into that, as well as solidarity, right? Like solidarity to me is, I think it's really hard to do the best racial racial work without solidarity. Like I would actually even challenge, like, is it racial work without solidarity?
Yeah.
Right. Like that's a different debate as well. But I thought like how you framed it and how you, taught us was, just amazing. And, I definitely want to get into this book that you mentioned, Louder Than Lives. But before I do that, I just wanted to share, like, after I took this class, the Atlanta Hawks, our coach at the time, Lloyd Pierce, he had this thing called Breakfast Club. Every 2 weeks, he would have a different player give a presentation. It could be on anything about who you were, your history, or whatever. So I actually did a presentation on Asian American history, just basically taking the highlight points from your class and sharing that with this team. And the feedback on it was like it was, I had people come up to me, like I had my white coaches and my white teammates, my black coaches and my black teammates. Afterwards, they came up to me, gave me daps, or they said a bunch of stuff, or they sent me text messages, but it was all like, man, like, thank you so much for, like, I never knew, because for most of them, I was like the only Asian they ever met or knew. And so like, they really had no exposure to it. And there's another part where, I don't want to say it because I might mess it up. So I don't know if you remember, but I think you taught us like the analogy of cultural communication within sports.
Okay. Yeah.
Like that to me, I shared that in many situations ever since that, but it's stuck with me. But yeah, did you want to kind of share that really quick?
When I was taking like a workshop, I was taking a class on how to teach English learners, basically. And I remember somebody shared this study, or I don't know if it was a study. It was kind of like a framework. And they were trying to teach about like cultural communication styles. And so they said, for East Asians, we have, when it comes to like group discussions, there is a cultural style that they compared it to bowling. So this idea that everybody takes their turn, right? It's like one at a time. And that often in between speaking, there will be pauses, all that kind of stuff. And then, American English is like basketball, meaning like you're passing the ball back and forth, and then, but there are rules to like when you can steal the ball, you can pass the ball, but it moves a little quicker. And they were talking about there are other cultures, a lot of African cultures, Mediterranean cultures that are more like rugby, where it's like super energetic and everybody's just like on top of each other. And it's like like that. And so this, like when I learned it, it was just more to help us to understand challenges our students might have in learning English. Like that might mean that they need to pick up the pace of their discussions a little bit. And then as an Asian American person hearing this for the first time, this is getting into my story a little bit, but it dawned on me. I was like, you know what? In class discussions at school, I always felt I was like a little bit behind, right? Like, the teacher would be like, does anybody have anything else to say? And I'd be like, I do have something to say. I'm going to raise my hand. And before I could even do that, it'd be like, okay, no one's saying anything. I guess we'll move on. And it'd be like, like I missed my chance. And so like learning about this analogy was like, oh, like I always attributed it to something like I was just bad at discussions. There was something wrong with me, right? But I was like, oh, maybe what it is that when I discuss with people in a group setting, I kind of have this East Asian speed, right? But also knowing more about the system of white supremacy, where race comes into play. Like, it's not just that we have these different communication styles. It's that like certain styles are vilified or considered more superior than others, right? So it's like the basketball style, which is like the white American way of like communicating, is like considered superior. And then those of us that are either doing like the bowling style or the rugby style, like the bowling style, like then we get like stereotyped or vilified as like, we're too quiet, we're sneaky, we're not trustworthy because we're not saying anything. We must be planning something behind the scenes or something, where it's like, really, we're just trying to keep up with the pace of conversation sometimes. And then people that communicate with the rugby style, right? It's like they get vilified as like, they're too, what's the word? Like they're too unhinged, they're too emotional, right? It's like dangerous and it's intimidating, right? And it's like, I think they're just communicating in a lively way, which is like appropriate to the way they communicate. But so I think that was basically kind of what I shared with you guys. But I'm so glad that it was so easily, what's the word? applicable to your situation. Because I do think actually teaching that class and learning more about your situation, it really like it continually dawned on me what a unique position you were in as, you know, at the time, like the only Asian American person in the NBA that is a very culturally Black space. And so it's like the interactions that you were having are very unique for the typical Asian American person. And it's because it's not that you grew up with surrounded by Black people in a Black community. It's like you came from like Palo Alto, which is very kind of like white and Asian, but then you were kind of also in these other spaces, these basketball spaces. And so I loved that it was so useful in those situations and you found it really useful. Like that makes me really happy because like, you know, I teach a lot of these things and I'm like, I think these help, but then to hear that they actually do in the real world is very like helpful for me and be like, okay, yes, like I'm not just making it up, right? It's like this actually helps people. It helps us, right? It helps us like live together.
Yeah, no, that was, I mean, it was like, it shifted the whole paradigm with which I viewed kind of my experience in the NBA, because I always asked myself, like, why am I so quiet? Like, why am I extra quiet in the NBA? And at first I thought it was like, oh, you're shy, or like, you know, you're intimidated or whatever. And I started thinking about it. I was like, no, that's not really it. Like, because I'm actually really willing to say what I want to say.
Yeah.
And when I'm in one-on-one settings, I have really direct, very upfront, like surprise. People are like, dang, like caught by surprise, just how direct I am. And so why was it that like in the majority of settings, which are group, why was it that I felt like I couldn't get a word out? And it finally like dawned on me, like we're playing different sports. And what happened was I felt like so many people perceived me as quiet, but really weak, right? Like it was like, he's weak, he's scared. And that really like gave me a lot of validation, because I was just like, dude, you don't get to where I got to by being scared. Like,
right.
I got here because I was ready to take on any and everybody time and time again to prove like who I was as a player. But there was always that perception of like weakness because I was communicating just through even communication. Right. And so that was something that like really opened it up for me. I shared that with my team, and the owner's wife, Mrs. Wrestler, was there, and she like was raving on and on about this breakfast club that I gave. And that kind of just spawned something totally different, right? Like I started to understand, basically, I just had a lot more empathy for any other minority. I started to understand my own identity more. And the next thing you know, there's the Stop Asian Hate and all these different things. Yeah. And I'm able to actually talk about like, you know, because growing up, I was like, I know a ton of Asians. And even Chinatown, I was thinking just like, oh, people, you know, Chinatown is because like, you're just homesick and you want to get like good. No, Chinatown was for survival.
Yeah.
Like Chinatown, if there was not Chinatown, like, Asians wouldn't have survived in the US. And just understanding just how embedded white supremacy was in the history of this country. I mean, it just changed everything. Even when you get to talking about like the Japanese incarceration camps, which like is very different as, you know, me not being Japanese, like, but even that really shaped things for me, going on to the Exclusion Act and so on and so forth. And from there, it just like, I started reading, and I started reading a ton. I've read so many books on race, identity. That was just like the journey that you kind of sent me on to really understand more and more of myself. And then Stop Asian Hate, Patricia and I co-wrote, but mostly Patricia wrote it. I just put my name on the assignment. But Patricia wrote this amazing article after the Atlanta shootings. Yeah. And then, you know, we had 38 at the Garden, which was an Emmy award-winning sports documentary centered around insanity and race, and all that to say that what you did really opened up a whole like Pandora's box for me. I just started to learn a lot more. I started to get a lot more deeper conviction, and that was just my perspective. Everybody else in the class also was getting impacted by it too. The brand, the foundation, the work that we do today, what we stand for, a large a part of it that came from, and a depth of that, a lot of that came from this class. And I also have to give a huge shout out, not just to you, Ellie, but obviously Patricia as well. You two have been instrumental in my life in terms of like, and then that's why now one of the biggest compliments I get is like, man, I love how represent Asians, and I love how you represent your faith, right? Like those are like the top two things that I continuously hear. And so a lot of that kind of came through that class as well. So yeah, that was a lot, but that was kind of just the momentum that you gave me through the class. It hasn't stopped.
Yeah. I've always thought it was really commendable that you and your team, like, you got to this point where you're like, we need something more. And it's always kind of surprised/shocked me that, I think most business teams think we need like a consultant to like help with our branding, or we need, something like that. And the solution that you guys came up with was, we need more history classes. That's what we need. That's really going to give us a good foundation. And so I've always been really impressed by that. I mean, not just because I'm a history teacher, but I'm like, yes, like, I think even now when I look at kind of the terrain of Asian American activism, and like, because of COVID-19 and, the increase in anti-Asian hate, there's a lot of people that are really wanting to help the community to really, do something. And I wish they would all take a step back before, just diving in, and take some time and really learn about what the system of white supremacy is and how it works. Because I do think sometimes I get a little frustrated because I see people that want to help so much. They are trying so hard. And I think, I think they would do things a little bit differently if they understood a little bit more about how the system works. And if they only knew those things, I think their solutions would be a lot more impactful. And hopefully they wouldn't fall into the trap of, because the positioning of Asian Americans is, it's very possible for us to want to help ourselves. And it feels like we're helping ourselves, but we're actually not doing anything about the system. Right. And so if we want to create like real, true solutions that are really going to help build a better world, like, we need to, our solutions have to take the system of white supremacy into consideration. And so I've always been really, I've always admired the fact that that's what your business team did. And so I think it really shows as well, because I think people do find, they look at your platform, they look at your brand, and they're like, man, there's something different about Jeremy's platform. I'm like, yeah, I think it's because they are thinking about not just Asian Americans, but the whole system. Like, what does it mean to move in solidarity? What does it mean to really be somebody that's trying to work with other people and create a better world for everyone, right? Not just ourselves, but for everyone. So I always just thought it was really cool. I'm like, history lessons. Wow. It's not the usual idea that you hear thrown around, in entrepreneurial spaces.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I like to quickly solve problems, but that's why I have a team around me, because I keep saying Patricia has just been adamant. Like, if you ever come into a space and you try to jump in and solve problems, you've got it all mixed up. The first thing you need to do is learn, sit, and be present, and do that enough, awkwardly enough, until you develop convictions, and then start. And, this is one analogy that I saw done at a high level. But when Joe Lacob first bought the Warriors, the first thing he did was to not really do anything. And it was interesting because my rookie year was with the Warriors, and he had bought the team, and he said, I'm going to observe for a year, and then I'm going to make changes. And then he started making a ton of changes, controversial changes that ended in 4 championships. But it started with a year of nothing, of observation. And so that was, the similar concept that we obviously as a brand, we're trying to kind of adopt is to do that. Another thing that happened recently is you wrote a book, Louder Than Lies.
I did.
And I just wanted to kind of ask, like, what's the background? What was the inspiration? Why now? And just hear your thoughts around this book.
So, actually, a lot of the things that we did in the course were a precursor to what actually ended up in the book. So I think when I was teaching the course for you guys, it was my first time teaching only Asian Americans. And I really enjoyed it a lot. And I was like, man, if I could only just teach Asian Americans about, race and what it means to be Asian American, like that is really fun for me. And so actually coming out of teaching that class, I was like, why can't I? I'm like, I'm not employed by anybody else at this point. Actually, I was staying at home. I was kind of developing curriculum or things just like on my own. And kind of looking at like, what do I think is needed? And I was like, I think Asian Americans need more education, basically coming from your guys' group where it was like, if you guys are representative of any small group of Asian Americans, because I was like, you guys all know each other. You guys are all racially very similar. Some of you guys are family members, grew up in the same family, yet you still needed to have this education to create stronger roots among yourselves and empower you and give you guys a sense of direction. So it made me think a lot about I think the Asian American community, because I think we get a lot of criticism for why don't you understand this? And I'm like, I think there is just a severe lack of education among the Asian American community, not by fault of our own, because nobody's teaching us Asian American history. There are some programs now, but very few of us, if we're not lucky enough to happen to go to a high school that has, an ethnic studies or Asian American history program, or a college that has, most of us will never learn anything unless we specifically seek it out ourselves, right? And so, so that I put a lot of what started out in our class, that is basically kind of what the book is. So it's let's talk about what it means to be Asian American, but do it in the context of increasing our understanding of what is the system of white supremacy, how does it work, what's the history of how it was built and how Asian Americans fit into it. And by understanding that more, how can we understand our day-to-day experiences? So the book is divided into 3 sections. So the first section is just kind of I tried to make it as readable and as approachable as possible. I was a high school history teacher. Let's make it really easy to understand. I want high schoolers to be able to read it really easily. I also wanted my immigrant parents that, they're fluent in English, but, maybe reading a history book is really hard. So how do I make it super easy? So the first section of the book is some basics about what the history of how the system of white supremacy was built. The second section is talking about kind of everyday ways Asian Americans interact with the system of white supremacy. But because we, of our positioning within the system as a little bit higher than other people of color as a model minority, sometimes we don't realize that that's what we're interacting with. And then the last section is all about what are things that we can do starting now to start dismantling the system and kind of the values behind that. So that is the main content of the book. But the why now, I started writing the book in 2020. So 2020, we were all there, but COVID-19 hit. The death of George Floyd by the hands of police. There were a bunch of protests. At the same time, you have this huge increase of anti-Asian hate going across the United States. And so I really saw a lot of people, a lot of Asian Americans specifically, a lot of questions. What's going on? A lot of shock at what seemed like a sudden increase of hate. I think a lot of people that grew up in the United States, even kind of closer to our age, this might have been the first wave of anti-Asian hate that we had lived through as conscious human beings. Because I actually,
Yeah.
as part of researching this book, like I had kind of heard about other waves of anti-Asian hate, but like I was born in 1980. So like I didn't even know that in the 80s there was like also a huge wave of anti-Asian hate, but like I was a small child. And so I didn't know about it at all. And I just thought, oh, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, you know, it was so easy, seemingly easy, right? And so, but I saw a lot of questions. I saw a lot of like distress. And I saw a lot of desire for people wanting to get involved, trying to understand race and wanting to do something about it, but kind of feeling directionless, not really knowing what to do. At the same time, there was the death of Christian Hall, who was like a young, he's like a Chinese adoptee. He was shot by Pennsylvania state troopers when he was having a mental health crisis. And so like all of those things are happening. And so, which was a lot, but like, I remember reading an article about Christian Hall's parents. Like he was adopted by a Black father and an Asian American mother as a Chinese adoptee. And his father had said that, you know, in the weeks, months before Christian's death, he was having a lot of questions about what it meant to be Asian American. And his dad had no idea what to tell him. And so, like, I mean, you've talked a lot about mental health in the past, but like, you know, we hear these statistics about, you know, suicide is the number one cause of death among Asian American youth. Like mental health is a huge issue in Asian American communities. And I read that interview with Christian Hall's dad, and I was like, I have something that can speak to this. Like, I'm not a therapist. There's only so much I can do about mental health. But if there are some foundational questions about what it means to be Asian American, like that's my passion. And so I was like, I really felt this conviction that I need to start getting more of my work out there, right? And so like I was at home with my family, you know, and I had materials that I had made for your class and other things. And I thought, you know, all this stuff is just wasting time on my computer. And so I started posting certain things online, you know, and then it got the attention of my agent, my literary agent, Charles Kim. And so he saw one of the guides that I made, and he's like, are you writing a book? You should write a book. And I was like, I don't know how to write a book. I mean, I'm not like a prolific writer. Writing is like not my number one go-to thing, right? So it took a little bit of convincing that I could even write a book. Like I really didn't know if I was like physically capable of producing the amount of words that, like writing the amount of words that would contain a whole book. But so it took me a long time. So like all through, so I think I started the summer of 2020, and it took about 3.5 years just to write the first draft of the book. So I mean, I was a little bit slow about it, but I was also really busy with my family, you know, quarantining, all that kind of stuff. So it's like 4 years later now, and the book is actually coming out, which is kind of incredible. But I would have to say also during that whole process, like I was living through these things with everybody else, right? I was seeing Asian Americans being attacked on the streets. I was seeing all these questions. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like even me having to deal with, just as an Asian American, and even my own experiences of being like harassed or something like that, you know, like it's like it was just like kind of this, it all kind of all happened at the same time. So it was a really intense time. But yeah, but I mean, that was the impetus for this book. And so I do feel, you know, I think I probably wrote it slower than a lot of people would have preferred, but that was me. I was like, Ellie, I just have to be me. Like, I can't rush it. I want to do it well. I don't know if I'll ever write another book again. And I really want to make sure that this is something that is a very usable resource, approachable, easy to read, robust, that's really going to help people. And so I'm really proud of how it ended up, but it was a lot of work and it took a lot of time. And I'm like really excited that it's coming out finally and that I can actually like share it with other people, and hopefully it'll be really helpful.
That's awesome. No, I'm definitely glad you wrote it. And I do think a lot of people will be encouraged by it. And, you know, I would definitely encourage everybody to go check it out if you can. Louder Than Lies.
Yeah.
Right before we let you go, I wanted to ask, just two more questions around the book.
Uh-huh.
First one is, what was the hardest part to write?
The quick answer is the hardest part is I can't remember the chapter number because we had to switch some of the chapter numbers, but it's called We Are Demonized. And basically it's a whole chapter, and I walk everybody through basically since the beginning of US history to the present, all the waves of anti-Asian hate. And so that it was by far the hardest chapter to write because I had to research a lot, and because I was telling people's stories, right? I really wanted to make sure that I was getting it right, that I was honoring people. And also, I'm East Asian, but like Asian American isn't just East Asian. So it also includes other Asian American communities. And so it was like the violence that was experienced by these other Asian American communities that I'm not personally a part of. Like, I really wanted to make sure that I was honoring them, getting their perspectives right, getting the details right. So like that one chapter, every other chapter of the book, I was able to write at home, everyday life, my family around doing everyday things. But that one specific chapter, like I had to be away. So like I took 2 writers' retreats just to write that chapter. It took a long time, and I like dreaded it a lot. And I actually, I started going to therapy mostly just to get through that chapter, as well as, the book in general. But I realized that chapter, like, and finishing that chapter really culminated a lot of my own kind of racial trauma. Because like, when you write a book about racism, you have to also deal with all of your own experiences. And then also doing that during a time period where, I might have like a writing session, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to take a break. And then I'm going to pick up my phone and go look on Instagram. Well, hey, what's going on? Thinking that I'm going to like look at funny memes. And then like I'm seeing videos of Asian American elders being harassed in the street, or, like terrible news, or like, shootings, things like that. Right. That's a lot. So I do not think I would have finished the book if I had not found a therapist and gone to therapy just to kind of deal with all of it. And then I know, like, I was also personally dealing with my own racial trauma that kind of manifested itself in like, a lot of imposter syndrome. Like, who am I to say these things? Do I know anything? I'm not a professor. I'm not an academic. Like, I'm a fraud, dealing with that. As an Asian woman, I had a lot of anxiety about my personal safety, because, speaking boldly and clearly about white supremacy, about racism, isn't always like the safest thing you can do as a person of color, right? Sometimes that causes a lot of backlash and things like that. And so I had a lot of anxieties about like, is this safe? Like if I do this, like, I think this is something I knew I was going to finish the book. But like my mind would start racing about like, well, when it comes out, like, well, what if I start getting harassed? And then like, I'm a mother too. So I really had to deal with a lot of those anxieties and fears that were kind of rooted in just like, a lot of the, like, my racial experiences, because it's kind of like that double-edged sword of like, it's really important that we understand white supremacy and racism and the experiences we're having. But then, like, I've had friends tell me my problem is that I know too much, right? Because it's like I know all the worst stories. So then it's hard for me to like, I needed to kind of be like, are those things going to happen to me? Like, am I just like setting myself up to be like violently attacked or something like that? And so I really had to work through a lot of that just to get the book out. And so, and then, I mean, not just therapy, but like making sure I was surrounding myself with really supportive friends, setting up boundaries, you know, like there are people that want to be helpful, but they're not always helpful in the way you need them to be helpful. So you're like, okay, I might need to set a boundary here. Making sure that I was taking care of myself, taking time to recover after stressful things, all that kind of stuff, like learning to take better care of myself. Like if I'm going to do this type of work that is about something that's pretty intense, but exceptionally meaningful and exceptionally important, I was like, well, I also have to prioritize my own health, to make sure that I'm doing right by me. And I can't show up well for other people if I'm not showing up well for myself, So, there was a lot of behind the scenes, work that I had to do just to finish the book and to like approach this like publication thing, feeling okay about it, I guess.
Yeah. No, that sounds like a lot. So I appreciate that. I mean, they say, I don't know where I read this somewhere, but basically every book, is on average like 40 years of expertise that qualifies somebody to write a book. So every time you're reading a book, you're reading 40 years of expertise in one category. So like the amount of expertise that you have to be able to write this book, I definitely think a lot of people will benefit from it. And the last question I wanted to ask is a very open-ended question. You can take it in any direction that you want, but whether it ties into the book or not, but like for people who are listening and have continued to listen to this entire podcast and are interested in this topic of race, what's one thing that you want to leave them with, or even what's one thing that maybe you dive more deeply in the book that you would want to kind of leave the listeners with?
So prior to writing this book, I was actually a part of a cohort led by, her name is Dr. Christina Cleveland, but it was like a cohort for emerging leaders of color. And I was having this one-on-one conversation with her, and she's a Black woman. And I was telling her more about like my passion about like, Asian American community and like wanting to like, like teach about anti-racism, all that kind of stuff. But I was spending a lot of time not in Asian American spaces specifically, because I think most Asian Americans would agree is that sometimes spending time in Asian American communities is like a huge headache, right? If you talk about race, there's so much anti-Blackness. It's like you just don't even know where to start. There's a lot of, baggage from cross-cultural miscommunications, all that kind of stuff, right? And so it can get very frustrating. And so I had found a lot of solace, spending time with like Black women, Latina women. And I'm like, oh, let's just be around other women of color. And Christina Cleveland was listening to me talk about my passion for Asian American communities. And she looks at me and she goes, Ellie, you need to go to your people. You need to go to your people. And I was like, but we're annoying. Sometimes it's annoying. Sometimes it's hard, right? Asian Americans, we criticize each other incessantly, right? And I'm like, I don't want to be criticized. I don't want to be, told everything that is wrong about me, right? I don't need comments about my weight and my hair and, like all that kind of stuff, like the random stuff. It's just like, you need to go to your people. And so like that sound, like what she said would ring in my ears. And I'd be like, in order for me to go to my people, I need to learn to love my people. And I realized what I had to do is I really need to start like actively trying to love not just like other Asian Americans in the community, but also myself. And so I think, I really tried to infuse the book with a feeling of a lot of grace, a lot of patience, a lot of love, right? The way like a teacher or a mother would talk to their student or child and be like, let me bring you along with me. I was I was in a place where in my own life was like, I'm just sick of being criticized all the time. We're always being criticized by everybody, right? Like as if it's love. Like sometimes it can be love, but a lot of times it gets tiring after a while. So I'm like, this is not a book that is criticizing Asian Americans. Like I'm trying to like move us forward. And so like the end of the book really culminates in like, well, how do we love ourselves better? Which actually was, I would say that was like the second hardest chapter to write of the book, where I was like, it feels really kind of cheesy and corny to be like, hey, I love myself. This is what I love, you know? And so it's like even figuring out how to write about like, how do we as Asian Americans cultivate more self-love? Like it took me some time to like figure out how I wanted to go about it, and what also felt true and not just like, you know, performative. And I'm like, see how much I love myself. I'm amazing. You know, it's like, no, it's like, like, what are we really grappling with when we say like that white supremacy teaches us to hate ourselves, right? Like this idea that like, oh, my Asian body or my Asian self is, you know, at worst a threat, you know, but maybe an inconvenience. Like if only I wasn't this, if only I was something a little different, right? But it's like, no, how do we silence those voices? How do we like counteract those lies that we're not okay just the way we are? And how do we really kind of embrace some of that self-love? So I think I really do hope that Asian American readers specifically, when they read that book, they feel very seen in a way that is nurturing. I really tried to put like all the best parts of myself in this book. You know, when I show up in person, you know, I can be as petty as the next person, but like I really tried to put in this book like what would I have wanted, like the gentle but clear voice, like honesty, but in a way that is not shaming. You know, like how do we move through this? How do we get over this hump so that we can empower ourselves and create better solutions for ourselves and create better health and safety for our communities and for everybody and for everyone. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I very, very much appreciate it. And I definitely think it'll be a great listen for, you know, everybody who's going to check it out. And just want to say thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for the course, the book, the way that you've impacted me, my team, and our platform. Yeah, I really, really appreciate it. And everybody check it out. Louder Than Lies.
Thank you, Jeremy. This was fun. I'm so glad we got to talk.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. To wrap things up, there's two main takeaways that I took away. Number one is to really try to be a part of the solution. You know, the first thing I think that Ellie really stands for and has taught me is to learn, and to not just jump right in and try to fix problems or solve problems, but to learn, to be patient, and to be humble enough to really try to look inwards and look backwards so that you can create a better future. Not just, you know, especially when we talk about race, one of the things that she really has stood on is to really understand race. Doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. It's very important to understand the holistic framework and to understand other ethnicities and their backgrounds and their history as well, and that it all ties into the framework that you know, you live under or we live under. And so that was something that was, you know, really helpful and convicting for me. The second takeaway that she talked about is as you share, as you learn, to be mindful of your own mental health as well as the mental health of others, that a lot of this stuff is very heavy. A lot of this stuff is heartbreaking. And a lot of this stuff really changes it, you know, whether we like it or not. Like learning this information changes us. We may, you know, experience bitterness, resentment, anxiety, you know, lack of confidence or lower self-esteem or whatever it is, anything that there's going to be inevitable changes. And as that happens, to continue to, you know, be patient with yourself, to love yourself and to care for yourself. And one thing that, you know, Ellie really stood by in writing this book was she wanted to be her best self and she wanted to bring her best self. And if she wasn't taking care of herself, she didn't feel like it was right for her to be able to tell others how to do that. And so I think that's a great principle that really stuck with me as well.